Well, our four characters have all been hard at work. Carol and Timber doing their A levels, Prune working in the store, and now they were enjoying themselves learning about their history, and all of them at the Indaba site. And that's where we left them last week. But what about Jabu? What had happened to him in the meantime? The last thing we knew, he'd had an interview with Mr. Eddington and he'd been offered a job. Well, Jabu had now worked for the prisons department for nearly a year. He always tried to make sure he did everything right. Discipline, he told himself, discipline and good manners get you far. He could almost hear his father talking. He worked in the same office as a strange guy called Aidan McBride. Aidan was so Irish that at first Jabu couldn't understand his accent or what on earth he was talking about. But they got to understand each other. Then they'd take turns to take the mail out or supervise the daily routines for looking after the prisoners in Kami Maximum Security Prison. Aidan was a couple of years older than Jabu and a well-organized administrator. Jabu watched and learned, picking up valuable skills every day. He was the first African to be employed in the prisons department, who was not a messenger or a cleaner. At first, the other Africans regarded him with respect, clapping their hands in greeting and calling him Mr. Ngube. But some resented him when he instructed them to do something. Others expected him to share his pay with them. Aidan was cross about that, so Jabu explained how things worked in Matabeleland, and that those who had money were expected to share it with those who didn't. It was sometimes hard, though, when he and Aidan went to the post office, because there black and white people treated him like a messenger, and some didn't like him queuing with white people. When the two of them stopped to have a cup of tea in Lubangula Street, some white people would glare at them with hard eyes. Jabu tried to take no notice. He dressed well and he was polite, but never too deferential. Being obsequious is no good, Jabu, he told himself. Stand tall. Most of all, he made sure that if Aidan did something well, he did it even better. The thing he loved was going down to Kami prison. At first, he'd been allowed only to drop mail at the desk and wait for messages from prisoners to be taken back to the office. After a while, he told his manager that he felt he was being treated just like a messenger, and he could do more to look after prisoner welfare if he was allowed to sit and talk with prisoners directly. Nothing happened, until suddenly last month, his new boss, Mr. Eddington, asked to see him. Jabulani, you have surpassed all our expectations of you. Well done. You have been here almost a year now, and I believe you'd be the right person to talk to the prisoners for us. We do need to find out more about them, how they are feeling and behaving. We might get reduced sentences for them if things go well, as we can make recommendations for a review if we feel it is warranted. We also need you to find out about their wives and their children and make sure that the prisoners have time to see them and to look after them. So Jabu started to meet the prisoners. Only the low security prisoners, but it was a start. He made sure he gave them the right messages and good advice so that this would be fed back to the prisons department. Jabu's aim was to be given access to high security prisoners as soon as possible. During the last year, the nationalists had begun to speak out more boldly against injustices. More and more of them were going to court, and more of them got jail terms. He'd been frantic to get finished early today because James Jikerema had been accused of libel, and he was in court this afternoon. Jabu had listened in disbelief when he found out what he'd done. During a rally of hundreds of people in Stanley Square, Chick had accused the Minister of Native Affairs of theft. The police had been waiting for him when he finished speaking. But Jabu had a long session at Kami that day because 4 of the prisoners had refused to eat their sadza, saying it had worms in it. The problem required careful thought, as it was a big test in leadership for him. So Jabu started by asking if he could walk through the kitchens and the storage areas. He asked the cook how this could have happened. The cook denied it completely, frightened he might lose his job. "Please help me, Mr. Mkube, please," he pleaded with Jabu. "I have 5 children and my wife in Gokwe, and I must have this job because now they have no land and no cattle." So Jabu asked him to show how he kept records of grain and meal deliveries, where he kept the mealie meal, and how he kept mice and cockroaches away. Everything was in good order. Clean, well swept, with grain on wooden pallets to allow for a free flow of air underneath, and with a rotation system to make sure older grain was used first. Jabu couldn't fault it or understand what had happened. Then he looked behind a stacked pile of old empty bags, and a fat rat ran out of a dark corner. "What are you doing about those rats?" he asked the cook. "The prison does not give me money to kill rats. You cannot run a kitchen with these number of people unless we have money to kill the rats." "Well, you have to store the mealie meal and the rapoko and other things that rats like to eat so they cannot get inside the cookie. Let's find where they have eaten a hole in the bags and something has got into the mealie meal." They found 2 bags with holes in them. Big white moths came flying out of them when they lifted them up to check. So the prisoners were right. There were worms in the sadza. Now it was time to report back to the 4 prisoners concerned on how this had happened and whether or not there had been worms in their sadza. Jabu felt irritated with himself because he just didn't have any answers or any ideas of how to fix the problem. Naturally enough, they were very angry with the cook for not checking that the mealie meal was okay before it was cooked. They were going to create problems until that cook was fired. So Jabu said to them, "This cook works very hard to make sure you get food to eat. He has a wife and 5 children in Gokwe, where is no land and no cattle. He cannot lose his job. The prison doesn't give him muti to kill the rats. I want you to find an answer to his problem. Now you go away and think." They went away to talk. When they came back, they said they thought that the prison should now keep 2 cats in the grain store to kill the rats, and that all the mealie meal must be inspected. Any bags with holes must be thrown out. If this was accepted, they would withdraw their complaint. "Oh, and by the way, the cats must be spayed, or there will be too many cats. Oh, and by the way, there must be a place where the cats can get out, or they might piss on the grain bags. Oh, yes, and they must have water, and sometimes some milk, and a little tasty food, so they know this is their home. Oh, and by the way, Sifas will look after the cats." So Jabu and the prisoners solved the problem. The cook was happy. The guards and the staff at the jail were happy. The 4 also offered to help sweep out the meal store, as long as they had double food rations that night, which they did, together with twice the relish. So they were happy too. Whenever he visited the jail, Jabu made sure he wrote down the names and the pass numbers of everyone he met. Today, it was the cook, the 4, and the grateful guard at the door to their cell. One day, he would use those names. But, on the other hand, Jabu was not quite happy. He had now missed the end of the trial for James Chikerema. He walked past the courts. There were people whistling and cheering and shouting. He watched as Chick was carried out of the courtroom on the shoulders of his friends. It was amazing. He'd been found guilty of libel, but had been allowed to go with a caution. The Southern Rhodesian African National Council, SRANC, paid his fine. John was happy for James Chikerema, but not quite happy for himself. He had hoped Chick might go to Kami prison, just for a little while even. Then he could talk to him. Oh well. Getting into work the next day, he saw Mr. Eddington on the steps of the office building. As Jabu approached, he walked over. Jabulani, we have had a request from Kami prison for you to accompany prisoners to the courts. It would mean going to Kami in the police van, collecting the prisoner, taking him to court, listening to the court proceedings, making sure the prisoner understands that what the court says must be done is done, then taking the prisoner back to Kami prison afterwards. What happens if the prisoner is released? Jabu asked. He would still have to go back to Kami to be discharged. He would then come under our department so he can get back to work or go to home to his family. Once everything has been checked at that end, you bring him back here. It was very difficult not to look too puffed up. He was only 17, nearly 18, and it was as though he was at least 25. He'd made himself popular with both the black and the white people, with his gentle, quiet personality sometimes, his thoughtfulness, and his sound and practical advice. They said, "Of course you should be the one who takes prisoners to the magistrate's court." But for Jabu there was a little problem. Here he was, 1 year in the job, and with many new things to take on, yet nobody had said anything about even a small pay rise for the extra work. He mentioned it to Aidan and asked him what he thought he should do. Aidan got all fired up. He'd been a member of his union in Ireland, and he was horrified to hear that there was no increase. He offered to go and talk to Mr. Eddington on his behalf, as it was a harder thing for Jabu to do. Later that day, Jabu received a letter from Mr. Eddington saying that, in light of his extra duties, his pay would be exactly double what he was now earning. He was so excited. He took the letter to Aidan to show him and thank him. Aidan slapped Jabu on the back and said, "Well done, it was well deserved." But then he sat for a long time, looking out of the window. Jabu asked if he was all right. He said he was, but he wasn't, because later that afternoon he went to see Mr. Eddington again. He shouted at Mr. Eddington, and Mr. Eddington shouted back. It was terrible. The whole office could hear the fight. A few moments later, Aidan came out, slamming the door behind him, and started packing up his things. He'd been fired. Jabu was shocked. What happened? Aidan wasn't talking, so Jabu shut up. He went to the SRANC meeting that night because James Chikerema was talking about his afternoon at court. It had been a terrible day, but this was exciting. Everyone was laughing and cheering. There was great excitement and many fists were punched in the air. Jabu turned to see Michael Mawema, a leading nationalist, at his elbow. "Jabulani, we have heard that you are doing very well at the prisons as a rat catcher." Jabu was overcome at meeting one of the nationalist legends. He stumbled out a greeting and laughed, wondering how the story had got out. Mawema went on, "We are looking for a membership officer for the SRANC. I have insisted on bringing younger members into the Central Committee. If you are interested, we will talk some more. It will not come about till next year, but we'd expect you to give out brochures and talk to people about joining SRANC. But we still have to print the brochures. Meantime, there are some small tasks we would like you to do for us." Jabu's face lit up. He could see his future racing towards him. "I would like that very much," he said. For the next half hour, Mr. Mawema asked Jabu all about the work he was doing at the prisons. At the end of the discussion, he said, "It will be useful for us to have you there, but it would not help if your employers knew you were holding any position in the SRANC. So this is another good reason to keep you out of the formal structure for a bit longer." Jabu went home with his head in an absolute whirl. First, the offer from Mr. Eddington yesterday, the doubling of his pay, then the 4 prisoners in Kami and the wormy Sadza, seeing James Chikarema being carried out of the courthouse on the shoulders of important nationalists to the whistles and shouts of hundreds of people, and now this talk with Michael Mawema. The only sad part of the day was that Aiden had been fired. And a sad part it was. But next week, something, again, quite different. The first sale of African cattle, indigenous cattle, and in particular of Tuli cattle, on the same basis as the white cattle sales elsewhere. Interesting stuff. I look forward to seeing you then.